Good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me clearly? Okay, it's the first time I speak in a microphone in this room. The sound is amazing. Well, welcome to Amaravati for this afternoon. So the way these Sunday afternoon talks work for us on this side of it is we get a bunch of titles that many members of the Sangha put together, topics they would like to hear discussed, reflected upon, they're interested in. So we are presented with a list of titles. And so the one has been sitting on my mind, which is today's topic, is the beauty of simplicity. And somehow it just makes my mind go still. But it's a very interesting phrase to reflect upon. I don't know how many of you have seen what we call the Tripitaka, the comprehensive body of books that consist of the teachings of the Buddha in Pali, but they're big, heavy books that take up a meter and a half on a shelf. And so looking at that, you kind of wonder, I'm supposed to find simplicity in there? But it's a bit of a conundrum, a paradox, the beauty of simplicity when we consider it in terms of Dhamma. Because Dhamma is really, itself is quite simple. It's just presence, here and now. The Buddha has this very beautiful way of describing it, which is one of Lompo Sumedo's favorite passages from the sutta, a very short one, where the Buddha talks about consciousness without feature, without end, luminous all around. And all the teachings in that meter and a half of books on the shelf are pointing towards that. So we come to a place like this, Amaravati, to a monastery, a place where they teach meditation, and we get to sit down like we are now, do nothing at all, physically at least, and we notice our minds are just racing all over the place, thinking of the past, imagining the future, full of hopes and expectations, worry, fear, concern. It doesn't seem very simple. But the way the Buddha talks about Dhamma, the path that he describes, that leads from this state of discontent in a way, where we're feeling restless. Very often our experience of the present moment is some form of restlessness is there. Sometimes we're actually suffering. Other times we feel things are quite okay, but all it takes is to sit down here in a room that's silent like this, spacious. And after a few minutes we notice this mind is actually a restless thing. Wait a bit longer and you realize this body is a restless thing too. My body, your bodies. We just sat down, so we're comfortable for now. Wait another 10 minutes and people start shifting and moving, and that's the nature of a body. The nature of the mind is a restless thing. It's feelings change constantly. It remembers, memories keep changing. Sometimes they're pleasant, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're memories we are happy to indulge in, happy memories of our childhood, of yesterday. Other times they're painful memories, traumatic memories, memories that come up and bring up remorse or fear. And then when we think about the future, we're often wondering what it's going to be like. And again, we can look at it from a positive state of mind and be hopeful, everything's going to be all right. Or we can think of the future and find there's a lot of cause for worry and concern and fear. So all this experience kind of does not leave us feeling very still. Things seem complicated. Bodies are complicated. Minds are complicated experiences. But with all these teachings of most spiritual lineages, most religions, and certainly the Buddha's teachings are a path of relinquishment, a path of letting go. Sometimes it's described as the path of non-suffering. It's a way of living our lives that does not cause more suffering. And as a lot of us probably have been listening to Lompo Sumedo's teachings, he's constantly reminding us of consciousness, awareness, how that is really what's at the heart of our experience, what receives experience, where experience arises and ceases. So as we're sitting here, noticing that we are aware, we are conscious, and noticing how each of our experience might be different in this consciousness, but we can all say, well, in consciousness, this is what having a body feels like. Sitting on the floor, sitting in a chair, feeling awake, feeling a bit sleepy, drowsy, feeling comfortable in the body or feeling a bit achy, restless. It doesn't really matter what the nature of the experience is. The point isn't the experience so much as noticing that this experience is being recognized, is being known. And that knowing is what consciousness does. And noticing what's going on in the mind. So it's 2:00 in the afternoon. Some of us are still digesting our lunch, so we may feel a bit like most of the blood is down here rather than up there. Some of us sacrificed what is our usual Sunday afternoon nap time to come and listen to some Dhamma. So maybe you're feeling nice and mellow and sleepy. Or some of us might just feel quite bright and awake, interested. What's he going to be talking about? Curious. So that's the state of the mind. It can be any one of those. It can feel peaceful or distracted, concentrated, centered, or scattered. And again, noticing that, not so much for the sake of noticing the state of mind, as much as noticing the awareness of the state of mind. That which knows it. It's not something that we find very easy to do, because our habit is to send the mind out into the world of experience, the world of sights, sounds, smells, tastes, sensations in the body, and then that whole universe of memories and thoughts of the future, imaginations, opinions, views. So that's where the complication lies in the world. The variety of conditions that we can experience, the variety of experiences that can arise or that we can seek. And in contrast to that complexity and variety, the simplicity, the unicity is coming back to this, what we call home, coming back to this consciousness, to this awareness. I don't know if any of you have ever read or listened to Krishnamurti or a tradition called Advaita Vedanta. They speak about, they use sometimes a slightly different language, but they have a way of talking about this purity and freedom in a very ethereal way. And in a way, in many ways, that's what the Buddha is talking about as well. But I was reflecting on the Buddha's teachings these last couple of days and thinking of how wonderful it is that his teaching describes a progressive path, where you're not just listening to someone who says, enlightenment is wonderful, you should be enlightened, try it out, it's really nice. And you wonder, it's like, yeah, sounds cool. How do I do it? You just do it. So some people kind of speak about it like that. And the Buddha's path is his teaching is very beautiful because it's very progressive. And the genius of the Four Noble Truths, the kind of heart of his teaching, what everything comes back to, where everything comes from in his teaching, is he talks about something that we can all recognize here and now. So 13 minutes in, we're already starting to shift and move. So noticing that. Noticing discomfort. Noticing how this body feels, how feelings in the body keep changing. Go from pleasant fades away, becomes neutral, and then something unpleasant arises. We can endure it for a bit, eventually we have to change postures, and then unpleasant passes, we're back to neutral or pleasant. So what the Buddha is talking about in his first noble truth, when he points out dukkha, dukkha is a very interesting word in Pali, which really does not translate very easily into English. Ajahn Asoko once pointed out that one of the ways dukkha is used in the Pali scriptures is describing how a chariot that has been made brand new has a perfectly smooth round axle for the wheels to revolve on. And as soon as the chariot is set on the road and starts rolling, it hits a stone, it hits a ditch in the road, a bump, and very little by little that axle starts getting nicked tiny bit at a time. And it'll keep rolling, but now as the axle turns, it starts making funny noises and the chariot actually feels a little bit rumbly. that experience, that lack of smoothness, that is called dukkha. So what the Buddha is pointing to is that in our experience. So it's not necessarily the suffering of being nailed on a cross, of having our being submitted to torture or anything like that. But we can see in our experience in life, we've all experienced suffering that's brought us to tears, brought us to despair, emotions and pain that can be, grief that can be gut-wrenching, where we can relate to dukkha in terms of the English word suffering. But then there's a lot of our daily experience which is just made of some very, very mild discontent that we usually do not recognize. Things like boredom. Nobody's ever died of boredom. And yet we all try to get away from it when it lasts for too long. So this is the kind of thing the Buddha is talking about. The small discomforts in the body and the small discomforts in the mind. And when he talks about ignorance being the source of suffering, very often that ignorance is not so much that we don't know. It's very often that we don't really want to know. So when we feel bored, we kind of take notice of it, look around, and then start looking for something that's going to interest us, that's going to stimulate us, distract us, rather than noticing boredom and taking an interest in boredom, sitting with it and wondering, how long can I be bored? We don't usually do that. So very often these little experiences that arise in our everyday life are things that are on that range of dukkha, that are things that don't really bother us that much, and we have a habit of moving on one way or another rather than stopping and noticing them. So that kind of ignoring those events, those manifestations of dukkha, of discontent in our lives, it kind of blinds us to the fact that life is made of all these moments as well. And because we don't notice that, then we get just carried along by the flow of our habits of seeking something interesting, a distraction, something to do, something to eat, to drink, to think of. When these things arise, and they do arise all day long, from the moment we wake up to the moment we fall asleep, sometimes as we're trying to fall asleep and we're lying there, still thoughts and memories of the day past, of the next day arising in the mind. The body trying to find comfort as we're trying to fall asleep. All of these are opportunities where we can actually notice what the Buddha is pointing to. And what's interesting when we start paying attention to these things and coming back to this reminder that Lumpur offers us of consciousness, knowing experience as it arises and ceases, we have the opportunity to come back to this consciousness. And very often, we know we're conscious, but we're trying to put our finger on it. We're trying to find something we can point at, something we can grasp hold of, something we can feel certain about in the way that we're used to feel certain about things that arise and cease. So Lumpur very often likes to remind people that if he asked any audience, anyone in the audience, are you conscious now? Everyone would answer yes. And yet if we try to point to that, locate it, we can't do that. You try to describe it, you're hard pressed to give a description of consciousness, of awareness. There's not a single experience that arises that is not made of consciousness. Everything we experience arises in consciousness, is known by consciousness, and ceases in consciousness. We're not accustomed to paying attention to consciousness. We're accustomed to pay attention to the experience arising and ceasing. And then when it has ceased, we're looking for the next one. Notice that habit in the mind. And then if we try to come back to consciousness, then what is consciousness? How do we recognize consciousness? Lumpur Sumedho talks about awareness being aware of itself. How do we do that? And notice when you ask yourself that question, the mind kind of goes blank, doesn't it? You can try thinking of an answer, trying to formulate an answer, but it's still just thinking. So we're sitting here in this room. You hear the sound of my voice, you hear the sound of that airplane flying overhead. And there's awareness that's aware of these things arising and ceasing. What is that awareness? And you can't answer that question. Not with words, not with images. You can't find consciousness in space. We can say these bodies are here. They're tall or short, big or small. We have these memories and thoughts that arise in the mind, out of which we create the past and the future. And like many teachers have pointed out, the past doesn't exist. It's just made of memories that arise here and now in the present moment that we grasp, and out of those memories here and now, we create the past here and now. We create it. It's a fabrication in the present moment. Same with the future. The future hasn't arrived yet. We don't know what it's going to be. So we imagine it. So images and thoughts are what arise in the present moment. And out of those things, we create this future. But it's just a fabrication in the present. So the past arises and ceases. The future arises and ceases as a creation in the mind, here and now. So we can know these memories. We can know these thoughts. But if they arise and cease here and now in consciousness, then what is consciousness? So the Buddha was really very, very clever in offering us many different kinds of tools that we can use to learn to recognize these things that we take for real, these things that we take for granted, and learn to examine them. one of these very, very useful sets are what we call the 5 aggregates, the 5 khandhas, which are really just 5 groups, 5 piles in which we can throw every one of our experiences. There's the body, feelings, generally qualified in his teaching as pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. Memories and perception is the 3rd group. The 4th group, which is called mental formations, is a bit of a big bag in which you can throw almost everything. But generally thoughts, emotions, moods. And the 5th one is how we experience consciousness through the senses. And every one of these categories is a group of things that we can actually witness as being impermanent, as arising, changing, and ceasing. So because of our habit of reaching out and grasping things and taking them for real, as something we can depend on, rely on, hold on to, what he's pointing out is that these things all arise and cease. So they can't provide a reliable refuge. We hold on to something that's going to kind of vanish in our grasp, and we're left holding nothing. But what's interesting about that is if we come back to consciousness and remind ourselves, consciousness is here and now. These things arise and cease in consciousness. So we can sit here and take that position of the witness. And so this experience of this body sitting here and now, it feels like this. Whatever it is, comfortable, uncomfortable, hot or cold, relaxed or tense, whether there's pain or no pain, or some parts of the body most of the body might feel quite comfortable, and then there's one part of the body that doesn't. But just whatever it is, noticing this is what the body feels like. Was it like that half an hour ago when we all gathered and sat down here? It wasn't, so you know this is changing. When we practice really staying with the body, coming back to the body and learning to remain with it, we start noticing these changes, we start noticing the arising of these feelings. And it's a very interesting thing to do, to be with the body when it's feeling hunky-dory, comfortable, relaxed. And you keep an eye on it, and we can go about our activities, but out of the corner of our eye, we keep an eye on this body. When is it going to change? And then you have a double espresso, and all of a sudden you feel absolutely buzzing with energy. You feel even better than you did. And you notice, okay, so this feeling has just arisen after hitting the caffeine. How long is it going to last? And just keep an eye on it out of the corner of your eye. And not knowing how it's going to change, kind of really being curious. Because sometimes we have coffee and then our heart is racing too much and becomes uncomfortable. Or we have acidity in the stomach. Sometimes we don't, and we just feel a great buzz, we're full of energy, get things done, feel good about it, and then the caffeine wears off and we're back to normal. Or it wears off and the energy crashes and we're yawning. But just as we keep an eye on these things, whatever the experience is, we notice, oh, this sensation, this feeling has arisen. And then we might get a bit of discomfort in the stomach. It could be because of something we've eaten, maybe because we're sick, maybe because something's happened that's affecting us, and emotions are tying our guts up in knots a little bit. But just whatever it is, just noticing, oh, look at that, that's happening. And as we learn to recognize this body and its sensations are always changing, and we keep asking ourselves, how long is it going to last? Can I stay with it as it changes? Can I notice when it ceases? When we're doing that, we're not being the body. We are not the body. We're the witness of the body as an experience being like this and changing. That witnessing, that knowing, that's consciousness, that's awareness. Just the knowing is awareness, and noticing how they change, how the experience of the body is changing, is informing awareness. Noticing how the mind, the moods change. When we're feeling good, usually we're in a good mood, when the body is feeling good. When the body is not feeling so good, it does affect our moods. Noticing that. The more we play around with this, with what in filigrane, what's the thread running through it all is this question: what is this consciousness that the Buddha is talking about, which is unborn, uncreated, unformed, unconditioned? What is this consciousness, this awareness that Luang Por likes to remind us is basically, if we want to identify with anything, identify with that. Just yesterday, he gave us this very nice reflection in the temple, and he was talking about how this awareness is really what we are. So what is it these wise people are talking about when they describe this as the place we can come for refuge, where suffering ends? And if suffering arises in the body and the mind, if we're taking refuge in this position of witnessing, of knowing, then suffering is just another condition arising and ceasing. And we are free. Not free from suffering because suffering stops arising, but free from suffering because we're able to know it and know that awareness doesn't suffer, consciousness doesn't suffer. Consciousness knows suffering is like this, it arises and it ceases, it's impermanent. It's interesting to notice that in a way this seeking is operating in every one of us. If you've ever listened to a few of the Dalai Lama's talks or read his books, the opening is always, we're all looking for happiness and trying to get away from suffering. That's always his opening statement. And it's beautiful because it is true, it's what we all share, it's in common to all of us. Not just human beings, but we look at the animals, the birds, the squirrels in the forest here. Any animal, they're also trying to find comfort and get away from discomfort. In a way, it's almost like we're all looking for that refuge. Where is it that we can find relief from suffering? Where is it that we can find this happiness? Most of the time, our seeking goes to areas that are not likely to provide any relief or any answer, because we're looking for the answer in the realm of conditioned phenomena. We look for happiness in that which is impermanent. We look for happiness in sights. We go to movies. We go on holidays to look at beautiful landscapes, to the Maldives, to the Seychelles, or Cornwall, or wherever it is that we go on holiday. We seek freedom from the suffering of hunger by looking for food, which is what these bodies need to survive. But then when we find food, we like to enhance the experience a bit by finding nice food, delicious food, and smells, and sounds, etc. So we are constantly looking for happiness, and we find happiness to a certain extent in the sense realm. But it is a bit of a thankless task, because if we keep finding happiness that doesn't last very long, then to find more happiness we have to go running around some more. So what the Buddha is pointing to is, first of all, noticing how we're looking for happiness in places where it's not very satisfying, actually. It's not satisfying because it's impermanent. And the Buddha is pointing back to this awareness, this consciousness that is constantly present, which is where the seeking is coming from, in the sense that we're looking for happiness, but we're looking outside. So we can't just very easily just turn it back and, like Ajahn Chah said, come back to our real home. If it was that simple, we'd all be done by now. What we're working with is a very, very powerful habit of seeking outside, of going out into the realm of the senses and of the mind to seek for happiness. So it's almost like we need to do a detox. We need to go out there and take a good look at what it is that we're grabbing hold of in order to find happiness and satisfaction. Take a look at it and realize it doesn't last long. It's ephemeral. And the Buddha was very, very kind in his teaching. So he doesn't say just abandon all sense pleasures because there's nothing there. Sometimes his language sounds like that, but he does talk about the satisfaction that arises through the senses. It is a thing. It is happiness. But it's a very shallow kind of happiness. And we won't realize that until we sit down with all these toys that we play with and take a look at them and actually pay attention to that ephemeral side of it. So sense pleasures are pleasures, but they're very short-lived. So what happens in terms of our seeking then? Well, when we start realizing how short-lived they are, we start wondering, well, is there something else to be found that provides a little bit more happiness than this? So the letting go of sense pleasures is not something we can do out of an act of will. It's letting go is always something that happens as a consequence of a realization. The realization that these forms of happiness are really short-lived, impermanent. Every time we experience satisfaction through the senses, when the source of that satisfaction changes, then we are dissatisfied. Our satisfaction ends and we become disappointed. We become frustrated. Why is this source of happiness always running through my hands like sand? And we try to squeeze it harder, hold on to it harder. So when we really pay attention to what we're doing, we pay attention to this habit of looking for happiness through the senses, realize what the nature of that kind of happiness is, how little return there is for a lot of effort, a lot of seeking, a lot of running after stuff. We do feel happy, but boy, the work, the effort that goes into so little happiness, so little satisfaction. That understanding, that realization is what is going to lead to dispassion. Is going to lead to losing interest in going after those objects of the senses as a source of happiness. We can't make it happen, but by observing, by looking, by watching and understanding, then this realization arises, the dispassion settles in, and the relinquishment becomes natural. And then when we let go of those peripheral things, naturally, attention kind of draws back in to its source, to the heart, to consciousness, because that's what attention is. That's where it comes from. So it's a very natural process. This morning I was reading a little bit of a question and answer session from some teacher with a disciple to Lumpur Sumedo, and the disciple was asking a little bit about how does one do this? How does one develop this seeking in a way that it becomes more persistent, more consistent? That we don't come, sit down together in this sala, be interested, and then when we all get on with our lives at 4 o'clock when it's over, we just forget about it and get caught up in the world all over again. And the answer of the teacher was very beautiful. He said, really, the heart is already there. The heart is where the seeking comes from and where the seeking leads back to. And the teacher was asking that disciple, when you fall in love, do you have to make an effort to be interested in the person you fall in love with? It happens naturally. And what they were pointing to is this relationship to this seeking is almost like trusting it, trusting that the seeking is leading us back here and now to the heart, to consciousness, to awareness. The heart becomes open, it naturally starts letting go and becomes drawn to what it's interested in, which is really ultimately itself. A lot of us coming from here in the West, coming from childhood and teenage and sometimes early adulthood, where we absorb a lot of education, a lot of information, we've learned to trust thinking. Thinking has become a refuge for a lot of us. It's what allows us to kind of get good jobs, earn good wages, live comfortably. And it does work like that, but in the process, we become addicted to thinking. I think very few of us have been to schools where they teach us thinking and then they teach us non-thinking as a break from thinking. I certainly wasn't taught that in school. And it's interesting to see how, after going through 2 decades of education where thinking is the activity that leads to desirable results, then we come to the monastery and sit down and we expect to find peace and silence in the mind, and what we meet is more thinking. And there's nothing we can do about it. It's conditioning. But what we can do is start to notice what thinking is, using exercises like what Lumpur teaches very often. Lumpur Sumedo talks about this exercise of intentionally thinking and noticing the gap between the thoughts, So we're not trying to get rid of thinking. We're realizing, okay, this is the conditioning. This is what we've got to work with. So rather than try to make the mind stop thinking and then get frustrated with it because it won't stop, and sometimes we throw in the towel because we try to concentrate and become peaceful and silent and quiet inside, and it just doesn't happen. And we get discouraged with meditation. That's because we're meditating from desire, wanting something we perceive as not having, trying to get rid of something we're stuck with, thinking. Whereas starting to notice the nature of thinking and notice how between thoughts there's space. Between thoughts there's silence. Taking an interest in that silence. Noticing what thinking does to the mind and to the body, how does it feel? And then when we pay attention to the pauses and the silences and the spaces between thoughts, how does that feel in the mind, in the body? Paradoxically, silence starts talking to us, but not in words. But silence does something to the mind when we pay attention to it. So rather than approaching this quest for happiness, this quest for freedom from suffering, coming from desire, learning to understand how desire works, and trusting that within us which is seeking, trusting that which within us which is interested in genuine happiness, happiness that is not necessarily based on the sense contacts. We listen to teachings. They point to something, they inspire us. There's something inside us that is attracted to that. What is it? And can we just trust that, allow that to be true? Because that's coming from the heart. It's a thirsting or a questing, a seeking that comes from the heart, not from thinking. Thinking can get involved, but that's not the point. So rather than try to make the practice happen, which is what we tend to do from our thinking, from our conditioning, when we go to school, we open the books, we complete the exercises, complete the assignments, return the papers, and we get graded on it. So we do something in order to get something, a pat on the head, and on to the next year. But this process of seeking for happiness, realizing freedom from suffering, it doesn't work like that. And the thinking that we have available, the teachings, these words, the teachings of the Buddha, the teachings of all these amazing wise men that are available to us until now, they're on the level of thinking, but they're pointing to something that is beyond thinking. So what is it about this process of practice, of seeking, of realization that is natural? And in coming back into contact with the heart and learning to trust that in the heart, which is looking for that. Trust that it is an organic process, that is a process of understanding and of realization that happens in silence. Learning to trust the silence, learning to trust the heart. That will naturally brings stillness. It brings us to this state of mind where we don't know. We're used to knowing things. We know about how to send rockets into space. We know about galaxies far away and subatomic particles, and we know how to create artificial intelligence and medicine, and we know how to build buildings like this. We know so many things, but on this level of seeking, that doesn't work. We don't experience happiness up here. We experience happiness here in the heart. So that's where we need to come back to, and that's where we're going to find happiness. Can we trust this space? Can we trust what happens here? Can we trust it enough to let go of what's happening up there? So we end up in this space of not knowing. And not knowing is wide open and silent. Not knowing is peaceful. And if we follow this encouragement that Luang Por has been giving us for the last 50-something years, trust awareness, if we're willing to try that out, well then what will happen? What will we learn from trusting awareness? And the only way to find that out is to kind of come back here, open up, be willing not to know, and in a way ask ourselves, what is there here and now? And that's where we meet that openness. That's the point here and now in presence and consciousness, where we're open to knowing how here and now is, without thinking, trying to answer the question, but knowing directly. That's the point where we can start witnessing conditions arising and ceasing, and every time something arises, changes and ceases, we can realize this condition is just passing. So this is not the answer. And little by little, learning to trust that awareness, learning to trust that consciousness. So I think I've said enough for now. I think there's some tea and drinks available, so maybe for about 15 minutes we could take a break, change postures. People who want to have a drink, I think this little cabinet here can offer a few drinks, and then there's a servery behind us, so please feel free to have some drinks, and at 3, we can reconvene. We have about 45 minutes of time for a few questions and answers.
As I was saying to you in the break, I'm interested in your thoughts on silence.
So the question is, can I say something about silence in relationship to tinnitus? So it's an interesting question because like Luang Por Sumedho has talked about the sound of silence He's used it and taught it for many years. And usually when people ask me about the sound of silence, I say, I don't know, you have to ask him. Because, and a little bit in the vein of this question, the sound of silence is something Luang Por is referring to, but it's not really a sound. Whereas if I just sit in a very, very quiet place, what I hear is the ringing in my ears. And that's tinnitus. It's not the sound of silence. But it's, I think tinnitus is something that we all experience to some degree. Some people are really plagued by it. But I remember even as a kid, and usually children's hearing hasn't yet been damaged by years of life. I remember going up into the Swiss mountains to do some skiing, and we get to the top of the chairlift and move off, and very often I like to let all the other people from the group I was with get carried away by their excitement and experience, because a lot of them were better skiers than I was. And I'd just be by myself at the top of the mountain. And particularly on days where it had snowed a lot, this very powdery snow, that stuff is an incredibly good material for stilling all kinds of sounds. It absorbs sounds. And I'd just be by myself at the top of the mountain, sometimes sitting in the snow, half surrounded by it. You kind of sink into it with no sound. You're far away from civilization. There are no planes overhead. There's no wind. And then you just hear this ringing. So that's tinnitus. And what Luang Por's talking about when he talks about working with the sound of silence, what he's really using words to talk about silence, is very difficult to describe silence. Silence is not something that we create. What we create is noise, sounds. And so the way we can work with it, work with sounds and learn to recognize silence. So that's what he's pointing to when in this exercise about using thoughts, intentionally thinking and noticing the gap between the thoughts. The mental silence, so to speak, when we're not just chattering away. We create thoughts, we create sounds, so they arise and cease. And the silence is the background. We don't create silence. So we don't really need to go out of our way to find it, to seek it, because it's always there. But it's a very good exercise because in the same way as I was mentioning earlier, we have this habit of sending the mind, the attention out into the world of sankharas, of conditions, and yet there's not a single experience, as ephemeral as experiences are. All the experiences we have in life are made of consciousness. If consciousness was not part of it, we wouldn't experience it, we wouldn't be able to know it, so it wouldn't be. But in that relationship of knowing and experience, we tend to get caught up in the experience, get interested in the details of the experience. And we never pay attention to the consciousness part, the fact that there's consciousness here that's registering, knowing this experience. So that's what the Buddha is pointing to, is coming back to that. Basically what he's saying is that it doesn't matter what the experience is, they're all impermanent, but the one thing that isn't is this. He usually refers to it in terms of negatives. It's a state where you don't have any sadness, any suffering, any this, any that. It's not a thing, it's not nothing either. So usually he describes it by describing what it's not because, and this is actually very intelligent of him, understanding our predicament of being so habituated to go in grasping things, the point is to let go And once we've let go of everything, what we're left with is consciousness, which is, we don't have to create, it's naturally there. So the point, what we need to learn how to do is to let go. If he gives us a definition of what it is as a positive, what are we going to do? We're going to go and grasp that. So it's actually very intelligent of him pointing the way and saying what it's not. So it's basically pointing to the things that we do hold on to, that we need to learn to release, let go of. So in noticing silence, so we don't create silence. You could say silence is the background in which sounds arise and cease. Tinnitus in that way, just another sound. We say, yeah, but it's always there, right? And yet, I don't always notice my tinnitus. I only notice it when other louder sounds cease. There. Looking after Lumpur Sumedo, boiling water, making coffee, sitting down with him, going over emails, reading something, planning something, and then after an hour or two we're done, moving on to the next thing. So there's always something occupying attention. It's only when I stop all of that and I go back to my room, sit on my zafu, Lumpur's in his half of the kuti, the dwelling, so I don't hear him. We live in a house that's of the same nature as this. We call it passive house, so it's extremely well insulated. And with that good quality insulation, you don't tend to, when the windows are closed, you don't tend to hear the birds, hear the planes, hear anything outside. It's very, very still. So I sit in my room, sigh, relax, and then I hear the tinnitus. So we say it's always there, but that's an idea. We create the idea that it's always there. My experience of it, even if it might be always there, I don't notice it all the time because I'm not paying attention to it. So in that way, it's also impermanent. And that's the nature of sound. And tinnitus actually changes. It's not always the same. Sometimes it's one pitch, other times it's another, sometimes it's dual, sometimes it's more one side than the other. So it changes as well. And noticing change is what allows us to come back to consciousness and realize that the knowing change. The knowing doesn't change. The knowing somehow is always just here and now. So when sounds, voice, coughing, whatever the sounds are, airplanes, they arise and they cease. If we're paying attention to the cessation, to the change and then the cessation, that's when we notice peace. So there's this very, very beautiful little verse that we usually recite on the occasions of people passing away and funerals. It's usually in Pali, but the English translation is, everything that's of the nature to arise is of the nature to cease. And in that cessation is peace. And it's a very, very beautiful, very profound little teaching, little reminder. When my stepmother passed away 7 years ago, I was in Asia. I wasn't able to come. I was with her a bit before that, but when she actually passed away, my sisters and my father were present and were with her, and then she passed away and they got on with the funeral arrangements. And they didn't really know what to do, so my stepmother's body was there at the undertaker's, right next to the hospital. It's a pretty bare room. They kind of furnish it very sparsely in a very bare way, because obviously they don't know how people are going to deal with grief. So if people want to bring anything to the room, that's their prerogative, but they don't want to impose in any which way. And I realized my relatives, in a way, that didn't really know what to do. And I have a young nephew, 3 nieces, and they'd never experienced anyone in the family dying, so they were a bit spooked by it all. And I knew what I would be tempted to do if I was there, but I was not there. So it was not up to me to deal with these things. But I did ask my younger sister to find a pot of some flowers to put in front of the coffin. Flowers are beautiful. They tend to attract us. That's usually how we respond to beauty. Like, oh, look at that. And we go towards it. And right behind it is this corpse, which is having the opposite effect on the kids, at least. It's like, oh, no, we're afraid of it. We're not sure we want to go and see that. So I asked my sister to put these flowers there and then put a message in front of it and put this message. All that's of the nature to arise is of the nature to cease. And in cessation, there's peace. What was interesting for me is I was using that as a reflection for myself. So I was in southern India with Lumpur. We were traveling at the time. And we happened to be in a very, very quiet place with some friends of ours who invited us to stay at their house, who were very undemanding, very gracious hosts. And so we had plenty of time to just do a lot of nothing. And I felt really privileged to experience the passing of my stepmother with so much time available, because my birth mother passed away when I was very young, 3 years old. I don't remember. So I can't actually say I know what losing my mother is like. So when my stepmother passed away, I was like, well, this is going to be interesting. What is it like losing one's mother? How is grief going to manifest? And I've seen over the years people grieve in all kinds of ways. Some people have a relative who dies, and they come to the monastery and they tell you, my mother's passed away, but it's really strange, Ajahn. I'm not crying. Is there something wrong with me? And then you go, a lot of the people whose parent die and they cry for months at a time and they can't stop crying. And other people, they don't necessarily have many tears, but they feel the loss in their heart for up to 2 years. And for 2 years, they keep coming for the monastery and they kind of express this grief that they're experiencing. So it can go from apparent nothing to apparent a lot. And I had no idea how it was going to manifest for me. So I was curious. And by then, I had enough experience and practice that I was able to bring to it this not knowing, being willing not to know, and to ask myself, well, what's it going to be like? And so it was very interesting to kind of notice what arose. And I was using this anicca, vata sankhara, whatever is of the nature to arise is of the nature to cease. And it was very interesting to notice in the mind what happens with that part of that little reminder. Everything that's of the nature to arise is of the nature to cease. So in a context like this, where we're all kind of experiencing ordinary circumstances, yeah, that's probably true. Whatever we can see and think of arises and ceases, and we trust that the Buddha says everything, so we go, yeah, he's probably right. It's kind of a neutral reflection, but when your mother has just passed away, it has a very strong emotional side to it. Everything that's of the nature to arise, Mum, is the nature to cease. She's passed away. I was like, oh. And that left me feeling a certain way. And in that cessation is peace. It's almost like that unlocked a different door. So rather than just staying with grief, is noticing that in the ending, yes, there may be grieving. Grieving is that kind of what we experience as something is ending. But if we stay with it, eventually it leads to peace. So in our investigations, in our explorations, in this kind of trying to understand this predicament where we're at and trying to understand these teachings of the Buddha that lead to the end of suffering, paying attention to endings is really interesting. Can I stick with something that has arisen and notice how it changes, notice when it ceases, and what is this peace that he's talking about that comes afterwards? Can I see that? Can I experience it? Can I recognize it? What is it he's talking about? It's very interesting. So with silence, sounds, tinnitus, then noticing change and being willing to just stay with it until it ceases. We don't choose when things cease. So some of these friends who experienced grief for a whole 2 years, they didn't choose to grieve for 2 years for the loss of their relative. Or this woman I was thinking of whose mother died and said, well, I don't really feel anything and I feel like there's something wrong with me because I'm not crying. She didn't choose to react like that. We don't control conditions. We don't control sounds. We can make sounds with our voice and stuff, but when we're sitting meditation and a plane flies overhead, we don't choose how long that's going to last. Ajahn Sumedho had this way of messing with retreatants when he was teaching retreats here, because people are really attached to experiencing peace. They want peace. They want concentration. And someone had gone, one of the very early retreats, had gone to the grounds caretaker and said, please don't mow the lawn around the retreat center during the retreat. It really disturbs people's meditation. Ajahn Sumedho got hold of that and he went straight to the caretaker and said, please mow the lawn during the retreat between this time and that time. And it was summer, the windows were open, and there's this long rower just making a racket outside the window. And he used that to show people desire for peace leads to suffering because of desire. Whereas being willing to accept the conditions as they are and just wait for them to cease leads to peace. And there's no desire there in that picture. If desire arises and we start grumbling and complaining in our minds about the lawnmower and the wretched caretaker who's not following our instructions, we can notice that. And usually once the grass is cut, he moves on, disappears. So you know what to do now, Gabor. Things cease. It's their nature. It's impossible to sustain things forever. So if we take this position of being willing, and it's really a question of goodwill, and it's also a very skillful way of developing metta. We think metta is just kind of spreading loving kindness to the whole world out there, like I'm the source of this radiance, of this sweet honey, gooey thing that I can spread all over the world and make it all pink and happy and rosy. Well, then I'm creating something. Whereas just the willingness to be here, present, with conditions as they arise, and if they're unpleasant, being willing, and sometimes we really have to encourage ourselves and say, can you just stay with this? Can I stay with this? Can I summon the willingness, the goodwill to accept this situation as it is? Not try to change it, not try to make it end faster. It'll end on its own. That's its nature. Can I just be present and witness that? And then remembering this little teaching, in cessation there's peace. What is, I'd like to taste that peace. That's not created. So then we don't need to go and look for silence behind the tinnitus or get rid of the tinnitus or the sounds or stuff like that. We're developing patience and goodwill and just waiting for nature to follow its course, which is to go to cessation. But tinnitus is a great teacher in that way. Yeah. If anybody wants to grab the microphone here, so yes?
I've got two questions. First one is, what is the relationship between mind, heart and consciousness? Are they the same thing, or are they two different things? And secondly, what happens to mind, heart and consciousness if people die?
Okay. So the question is, what is mind, heart and consciousness? Are they the same thing? And the second part of the question is, what happens to them when a person dies? Well, we were talking about language earlier. Thinking and language, they're pointers. So it's interesting to see how when we listen to the teachings or we read book about teachings on Dhamma, and I mean Dhamma in the general sense, not just in the Buddhist sense, like Dhamma in the sense of nature, of truth. We use the language to point towards things. I'm using words and I'm making a lot of noise to talk about silence. But the noise isn't the silence. The silence is something that the words are pointing to. And in that same way, mind, heart, consciousness, generally they're pointing to the same thing. Sometimes the word mind can be, the meaning can be that part of the experience of body and mind, so experiences in the mind such as pleasant, unpleasant, neutral sensations, memories and perceptions, thoughts, emotions and moods, and then how we experience consciousness through the senses. It all comes together. There's a part there that's mind, sometimes referred to as the mind, and in that situation, mind is referring to a whole bunch of impermanent conditions. But language is limited, and sometimes we get confused, but generally mind, heart, consciousness are pointing towards the same thing. So it's pointing to something that needs to be recognized, investigated. Sometimes when we experience something, we say, well, it's all just one big mess. How do I recognize consciousness from the experience that's arising in consciousness? Well, with practice. So these things are pointing to this awareness, consciousness, mind, heart. Sometimes we use the word citta from Pali or chit from Thai. So they're all pointing to the same thing, and it's not something that you can put your finger on. You can write words down black on white and you have something there. You have the feeling there's something you have. And then when you put a definition next to it, it gives you a feeling of knowing something, but you're knowing something in terms of information. Whereas the function, the only characteristic that you can really describe consciousness by is the function of knowing. You can't localize it in space. It doesn't have a size. It doesn't have a dimension, a texture, a color, a shape. It's here and now, only here and now, awareness. So that you can't describe it in terms of time, how long it lasts. Because it's always here and now, and it's what the Buddha describes as the unconditioned, the unborn. So you can't say it started when I was born and it ends when I die. That's what happens to the body. The body is born on the umpteenth of such a month and such a year. It's so many years old. It's healthy or not so healthy. It's strong or weak. And then it dies. So what happens to consciousness when the body dies? That's something we have to find out for ourselves. So we have people like the Buddha who point to the fact, who tell us this whole path is for the sake of the realization of Dhamma. Dhamma is again another word for consciousness and awareness. The ultimate reality. You see, there are so many words that describe this thing, and yet none of it represented accurately. They're all pointers. And the teaching is to be practiced. That's why we call it bhavana. It's to be brought in, to be investigated, to be experienced individually through wisdom, like Lumpur was saying yesterday. So what happens to consciousness when the body dies? Well, according to the teachings, the body is impermanent. Consciousness is the unborn, the uncreated, the unformed. So what happens to it? Well, I can give you an answer according to thinking, to the scriptures, to what the teachers say, to what Ajahn Sumedho says. I can give you an answer that I can come up with by myself, but all of those are just yet more words. Like there's some of these teachers who point to consciousness and talk about, it's not very frequent, but they talk about consciousness as pure consciousness is just there all the time. And it's only when we're in deep sleep, not dreaming, that consciousness is without an object again. All the rest of the time, when it's dreaming, the dreams are the objects of arising in consciousness, and when we're awake, there's the full package of the 5 aggregates, these 5 categories: body, feelings, memories, perceptions, thoughts, moods, emotions, and sense consciousness. So it's kind of a lot going on. So when there's so much going on, it's difficult to recognize consciousness. You have to start sifting through all these different things and like, is this consciousness? No, that bit is not. Is this? No, that's not. And little by little, as we go through it all, we start recognizing what's not consciousness. The body isn't consciousness. And like Lumpur Sumedho likes to say, consciousness is not in the body is in consciousness. Well, that gets you scratching your head, doesn't it? And it's basically use that to find an answer to that question. Because otherwise it's just another bunch of words, and you can believe it or not or disbelieve it, but it's not satisfying in terms of where that question is coming from. But if you use this, like I've used this a lot, I still use it a lot. The body's not in consciousness. The consciousness is not in the body's in consciousness. It opens an absolute can of worms in terms of thinking. And it exposes a lot of the perceptions that we take for granted from which we operate. And that consciousness fits into this body. And then when you say, well, if body is in consciousness, then the body is limited, consciousness is not. Where does it end? How far does it go? Is it like one of the layers of auras? Is Ajahn Karuna Dhammo inside that consciousness of mine? Or does he's senior to me, maybe his consciousness is bigger than mine. So his consciousness envelops mine, but mine doesn't reach to him. And you realize that all these notions still come from the assumption that consciousness has a size, has a reality, a materiality to it. That we can define it in terms of space. We cannot. Remember what I mentioned earlier, that passage that Lumpur likes so much? Consciousness without feature, without end, luminous all in every direction, radiant all around. Without end. Okay, it's infinite. And what do we have to illustrate infinity in our mind as well? The stars and the galaxies. The Big Bang, it goes all the way out there. Hubble, and now this other big telescope, I forget what it's called, can see even farther to the ends. Nothing can see to the end of the universe, but basically consciousness can. It's out there. And we're still thinking in terms of space. And you realize, well, we need to let that go. Consciousness is not a spatially definable thing. Consciousness is knowing here and now. Awareness here and now. So explore that, and as you'll find that as you explore this and you start yourself in your own understanding you start realizing, yeah, I can experience this body, but the body cannot possibly be consciousness, because it dies, it gets incinerated, and then what? And when we're asleep, and then we wake up and consciousness is there, what happens in between? It's for us to explore that and start to understand it. But use the guidance of these teachings to kind of keep you on a path that keeps you from straying off into to funny ideas. Yes.
I have a follow-on question to that. Sometimes experiencing life, we kind of get engrossed in what's happening around, and you're not quite aware of looking out of your eyes and experiencing life. And then all of a sudden you kind of become very conscious of the experience of looking out, and it kind of feels almost a bit detached by you're conscious of the experience. And maybe that's where you're explaining that a little bit as well. You're conscious that there's a body in this consciousness as opposed to being consciousness inside the body. How significant is that perception shift heading down the path? And is it something that happens often, or is it a sign that there is a shift? I don't know. Sometimes you just experience life and you just sort of have this moment where you just feel kind of focused and upside down and feel perception.
Well, sometimes we can end up in a funny spot through thinking about it, because it's not thinking has really serious limitations. Language has limitations. And so when we're trying to understand something that's way beyond language and trying to fit it into thinking, which is based on language, we're going to run into trouble. And sometimes that's what happens. We kind of do something and then all of a sudden we find ourselves not just in a dead end, but beyond the dead end into something we can't possibly compute on a thinking level, and we can feel completely lost. And we feel like it doesn't fit. Unless we trust what I like to refer to as the heart. So coming back to really kind of the seat of experience. And that's why it's so useful to really take on board this exercise Lumpur Sumedho has offered all of us so many times, intentionally thinking and learning to recognize the gap between the thoughts, the silent between the thoughts, because it basically gives us something to trust that's not thinking. We start recognizing silence and realizing that in silence we're still perfectly conscious, so we don't get lost, but we're starting to relate to experience from a more embodied position. And then noticing where I land in terms of what I identify with. So it's a progressive process. There's this very beautiful sutta in the chapter of the eights in the Anguttara Nikaya where the Buddha uses the ocean as a simile. And there's this being which we call an asura. I don't know if you are familiar with any of this. It's part of that kind of very fascinating cosmology, Buddhist cosmology with devas and all kinds of things. Basically, these are beings that live in the oceans. Very powerful and a little bit like devas, like angels of some sort. And the ocean is full of riches and is full of wonders. And this asura just comes up to the Buddha one day and says, the ocean is really amazing. He's basically just going ooh-ah about his own experience. And he talks about these 8 qualities that he finds amazing about the ocean. And the Buddha responds using the same 8 qualities, but applying them to the Dhamma and the Sangha. And one of them is, just as the ocean doesn't drop right off the edge of the land to the deepest part of the ocean, it's progressive. In the same way, there is no sudden realization. It's a progressive path. And when you start observing and practicing and investigating, you start measuring the depth of our habits, of ignoring what we don't find convenient to acknowledge. Usually in the realm of dukkha and suffering, we try to turn the other way. And when we start acknowledging it and start watching how much we tend to identify with this body and with this mind, with our emotions, our memories. I mean, we've all written CVs to get jobs. And this is me. We put it on 1 or 2 sheets of paper, give it to somebody. And when you think of it, you know that's not you. And yet we identify with, when we're just sitting around remembering the past, remember our childhood. And then in terms of experience, the experiences I had are different from the ones you had. But we tend to say, these are me. They're part of what I am now, my conditioning. And so even in my experience nowadays, the reactions that tend to arise in the mind in various conditions are colored, conditioned by my past experiences, which are different from yours. So your reaction will be different than mine. The nature of those experiences and conditions are not so relevant. What's interesting is to see how much we identify with them. And in that, we're doing the exact same thing. We're grasping that and saying, this is me. Then we have thoughts, opinions, views, and if we grasp them, then we end up with self-righteousness, and we get into a fisty fight, see who's right and who can impose on the other one. And that is how... So we learn not to do that, and then so things like precepts, don't kill other human beings. If we take that to heart and start practicing that, well, we realize sometimes we do feel murderous in certain situations. And it's always bound up with self-righteousness. It exposes it in a way. And then when we start practicing meditation and we start watching, we start realizing how much we identify with our emotions. All these interactions we have with each other, they affect us. They make us feel a certain way. Happy, unhappy. We agree, we disagree. I'm right, I'm wrong. You're right, you're wrong. Whatever these things are, the way we experience them, it feels very personal. So we start investigating that and we start realizing there's this kind of thing operating in a gut level that just wants to feel secure by grasping hold of something, anything at all. And you can even notice that sometimes in our own behavior. We keep repeating certain behaviors which we can recognize as not being beneficial for ourselves. We've all seen people who are just so habitually going to anger as a response to just about anything, that if there's nothing to get upset and angry at, they'll fabricate something. Because when they're not experiencing anger, all of a sudden, it's unknown. They're unaccustomed to the rest of experience when there's not anger as one of the landmarks in the... So people don't do this intentionally. Nobody goes and says, I'm going to be an angry dude. And this is going to be my warhorse in this lifetime, my identity. But it happens. And we realize that grasping, identifying, is something that we do out of habit. Because we're looking for happiness, trying to get away from suffering, and we think that we're going to find happiness in being able to hold on to something. If I hold on to this bottle, I can feel it. Whereas if I do this, it's like I'm not holding on to anything. It doesn't feel the same way. We want to feel solid ground under our feet. We don't want to go into freefall. And yet, sometimes in meditation, it happened to me. There was a period of time where this kind of perception was coming up a lot. I was traveling with Lumpur in the US, on the east coast of the US. And so we were spending a lot of time in cars, driving around. And I'm quite tall, so Lumpur, being very senior, sits in front next to the driver. He's got that big windshield and enjoys the view, which is very nice. I sit in the back, and being tall, the level of my eyes is usually level with the top of the window. So what I see is bushes and the road is zipping by. There's not much to enjoy. So to be able to look out the window and enjoy the view, I have to do that, and then I get a sore neck, and after a while I just give up. and just sit there, and you can chat a little bit with the people in the car, and then I fall silent. So I just leaned back and closed my eyes, and I started experiencing freefall. Like really just saying, well, let go. What do I need to consume? All these sights driving past, these beautiful coves on the ocean side in Newfoundland, going to see the Indian summer in the fall near Mount Washington, or forget what the name of the mountain was, up in New Hampshire. Spectacular colors for miles on end. I mean, all these maple trees going from orange to yellow and any red, and beautiful. And there's a thirst to see it, to experience it, to enjoy it. And you, after a while, it's like, it's exhausting. It's all this becoming, wanting to be happy through seeing something beautiful. And it's just miles and miles and miles of beauty, and trying to kind of not wanting to miss any of it. And finally, it was as much because I was getting a sore neck, cranking my head to try to get the view, as this sense of exhaustion in the solar plexus from trying to consume all that view and the desire not to miss any of it. So I sat back and closed my eyes and said, it's okay. What was I back then? 50 years old. You're 50 years old. You've been seeing, I grew up in Switzerland. I've seen beautiful sights for decades, all over the world. Do I need to see this? That's okay. And so I was just talking myself gently into letting go. And letting go all of a sudden left me with my eyes closed and the feeling of free fall. And it was wonderful because I wasn't afraid of landing. It was like I was out in outer space, holding on to something, and I could really relate to this sense of satisfaction of holding on to something, because it gives you a sense of security. And then when you let go, you lose your landmarks. You lose a sense of being anchored to something that you can come back to. You're in free fall. And yet there was a bliss that came with that, because I was free. I was free from all these things that I was trying to hold on to. So just be the willingness to be trusting that, because initially nobody wants to trust free fall. You step off a cliff, you crash at the bottom, you're dead. But in the mind, when you're talking about just presence, and presence is not going to crash on the cliff down below. That's what bodies do. Can I trust that? So we come back to trusting awareness, trusting consciousness, trusting presence, trusting knowing. Use whatever verbal cue will set you in the right direction towards this sense of presence here and now, knowing. And when you start coming in touch with it, can you trust it? And you'll realize at the beginning, you have to think about trust. You have to think about consciousness, awareness, heart, mind, whatever you want to call it, to try to gently bring yourself towards that. But little by little, you start getting a sense of what that is. And so in Thai, they have this very beautiful expression, Dhamma obrom chit, which means you use Dhamma to teach the heart. The heart is just the heart, but usually what's guiding it is just conditioning. The habit of grasping conditions, seeking for safety and security and samsara. And here, you're trying to teach yourself to do something different. But you can't snap your fingers and just do it, because the habits won't let you. In the process, we learn to recognize how powerful these habits are, of grasping, seeking for security, in just feeling something inside that grasp. And then trusting awareness. Awareness is not spatial, it's not material, it's not even anywhere in a timeline. You can't grasp, you have to trust it. It's something that happens slowly. Any friends we have, any people we trust in the world, we didn't meet them and trust them 100% just right off the bat. We get to know them, we live things together, and little by little we learn to trust them. And through experiences in life, the trust grows out of that. It's the same for this process. So if we can connect with anything in the heart, I mean, just the simple fact that we've come together here in this sala today means we're all interested in Dhamma, or whatever you want to call it. There's something in our heart that led us here that's interested in happiness and Dhamma. Start by trusting that. That comes from home and it takes you back home. And then little by little, as we trust it, the base that we start trusting starts expanding according to the wisdom that develops, the understanding that develops. So it's a progressive path, but through this trust, then it's okay to just do it here and now without worrying too much about results. Just come back to here and now, whatever it is that we can connect with now. And sometimes what we can connect with is, I don't know anything. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what I'm looking for. And yet on a non-verbal level, there's something there that's still wanting to connect with Dhamma. Trust that. Even if on an intellectual level, you may feel completely confused, lost, wrong, deluded. Doesn't matter what that is. We can let that be what it is. Come back to trusting this. And then from this point, it's like all of a sudden you're stepping out of the picture and watching the picture change. It will change because that's what conditions do. They cease. And in cessation is peace. So it's 4:00 already, but maybe just one last question.
It's always strange when you try to formulate a question, you get all the answers already. I believe you can witness consciousness in nature in lots of ways. And you see the connectivity between creatures or trees or whatever it is. And also, on one level, you feel that connection between people, complete strangers or whatever. And it's just so beautiful. But then you've got the consciousness, you've got the awareness, which are like two different things. And for me, awareness is fleeting. You have those moments where it's quite clear, the thought behind the thought. Another time, it's hard to grasp. But it does seem that consciousness and awareness are two totally different things. And also the feeling in the heart as well, which is that connection is where you tend to feel like.
Yeah, it makes complete sense because it doesn't really matter what the words are. For you, these words have those meanings, which are going to be different for many of us. As long as you can relate to the witnessing of it, and if it's impermanent, if it changes, then that's not yet it. That can be that's the guide. And then call it what you may. What you end up with when everything that you've witnessed that is changing, okay, that's not it yet. And you just keep letting go. What you end up with at the end that doesn't change is home. Okay, well, I hope this was a beneficial time, reflection. Thanks for all of you for coming.